band's back together, man, right? It's awesome. Thank you guys so much. That was just awesome. It's like, just keep going. Just keep going. So friends, this past week, all day Monday and Tuesday, this room, the sanctuary, was filled with tables that were filled with students from Lake Washington High School. So our neighbors across the street, there are about 50 of them here who were being equipped to do the hard work on the front lines at school, to be the eyes and ears who know how to recognize and how to respond to bullying and violence and exclusion, shaming. And I'm so grateful that they could be here in our space to do that, which was just awesome. They had Post-its all over the wall. I mean, just like all kinds of great things happening as they used our space. And I'm so glad, too, that we can continue to be mindful of them and pray for them in this important work that they will continue to do this whole year as they work to change the culture at Lake Washington High School. So it's just really wonderful, yes? Yeah. And yet I'm also so sad that a training like that even has to happen, right? Right? Right. And so, and we know that high school certainly isn't the only place where shaming and stone throwing are happening. I mean, did you watch the presidential debate this week, right? It is just like, it is so prevalent in our culture. So for us to have this conversation that we're having this fall about becoming we, about this radical act of loving our neighbor, looking at how the most important thing that we are invited to do is to love God, to love ourselves well, to love our neighbor well. As we look at that landscape, we just have to have in the midst of that conversation, we just need to dive into what we're going to dive into today, talking about this culture of humiliation and stone throwing that we witness in our politics, in our schools, in our communities, online. And it's becoming it's part of the air that we breathe. So we need to name that and recognize what is our responsibility as Jesus followers in the midst of this culture. And there's a lot of directions that we could go. I mean, I think this is probably like 6 months worth of material that we could cover about this conversation specifically. But specifically, we're going to dive into today the online world, how we engage on the internet and with people kind of virtually, because that is so much a part of our existence now. So to get there, we're going to start with Scripture. We always start by opening up the Bible and using that as a source of life and wisdom for us, seeing the story of Jesus as echoing throughout time with insight for us, with patterns that we can look at for how to live here and now. So today we're going to turn to a place where stones are almost thrown, literally. So I want you, as always, as we read, to visualize this unfolding. So you probably know the story. The heading in our Bibles often name it as "A Woman Caught in Adultery" is the heading. It's in John's Gospel, which is one of the 4 biographies of Jesus. So here it is, John 8, 1 through 11.
Yeah, John chapter 8, verses 1 through 11. Jesus went across the Mount Olives, but he was soon back in the temple again. Swarms of people came to him. He sat down and taught them. The religion scholars and Pharisees led in a woman who had been caught in the act of adultery. They stood her in plain sight of everyone and said, "Teacher, this woman was caught red-handed in the act of adultery. Moses in the law gives orders to stone such persons. What do you say?" They were trying to trap him into saying something incriminating so they could bring charges against him. Jesus bent down and wrote with his finger in the dirt. They kept at him, badgering him. He straightened up and said, "The sinless one among you go first. Throw the stone." Bending down again, he wrote some more in the dirt. Hearing that, they walked away, one after another, beginning with the oldest. The woman was left alone. Jesus stood up and spoke to her. "Woman, where are they? Does no one condemn you?" "No one, Master." "Neither do I," said Jesus. "Go on your way. From now on, don't sin."
As always, there's so much in this text that we could talk about, but I just want to say a little bit about it. So the religion scholars, the Pharisees, they bring this woman before Jesus, and had she sinned? Yes, absolutely. But is what they did, bringing her publicly before Jesus like this, is that okay? They brought her because they suspected that Jesus would want to tell the woman that her sins were forgiven. But that would mean that he would be teaching people to ignore something in the law of Moses that said that she should be stoned to death. So already we can, as we read this, we sense the temperature of the situation rising. Remember, this is just a piece of, like, there have been events before this and after this, and, like, the temperature is rising for what Jesus has been up to. And not only is the temperature rising, but you can also sense Jesus' anger rising, right? And rightfully so. Because do you see how the Pharisees are using this woman, however guilty she is of serious sin, simply as a tool in their attack on Jesus? And in so doing, they're also enjoying this sense of moral superiority over her, as well as their sense of having put Jesus in a corner that he cannot, easily escape from. So much, like, that's happening. So much of this scene should, like, make our blood boil. She'd be like, oh, that's not okay. And Jesus' answer, when it comes, though it's a risky response, I hadn't thought about this before, but it's a risky response when he says, go ahead, throw a stone. Like, what if someone had actually had the arrogance to throw a stone, right? Like, that's a really risky thing that he says. But his response is also, it's really devastating. I remember hearing a certain phrase when I was a kid that we shouldn't point at others. And when you point your finger at someone else, because what happens? There's 3 fingers pointing right back at you. You work with elementary school students. Like, you were like, there, Megan. Yeah, like, so you shouldn't point fingers because there's 3 fingers pointing back at you. This is ultimately Jesus' point. Jesus hasn't said that the law of Moses was wrong, so he didn't get caught in that trap, but only that if we're going to get serious about the law of Moses, we will find ourselves guilty. And one by one, then the Pharisees get the point, and they go away. So Jesus, in good form, he brings the Pharisees back to examining themselves and dropping the stones. It is this kind of honest looking at ourselves that the story of Jesus always invites us into. That the spiritual life begins here in our own selves, in our own hearts. Yes, to see our own mistakes and sins and brokenness that we are always carrying. And yet to hear again and again this invitation that Jesus extends to this woman, it's extended to us too, over and over again. You are forgiven. Go on your way. Keep on living. From now on, sin no more. So to step this story into a more modern context, we're going to read it through the lens of another story, one that made headlines in 1998. One that could also read, A Woman Caught in Adultery. In 2015, Monica Lewinsky, she spoke publicly for the first time in 14 years. And her TED Talk, most of which we're actually going to watch now, captures so many of these dynamics that we've been kind of rolling around in a little bit. The finger pointing, this culture of shaming. And as we watch this, I invite you to try this. So what we're going to do is place ourselves in the story that we've just read from John's Gospel. So in the story as this woman, like Monica, who, yes, has sinned. So we place ourselves there and aware of how, yes, this is us too. And we also place ourselves with honesty and curiosity in the story as the Pharisees, we also play out our self-righteousness sometimes at the expense of others. And so we are people who have those 3 fingers pointing back at ourselves sometimes too. So we're going to try to hold all of that, this story that we've just read from John's Gospel, as we hear Monica Lewinsky's words. So I'm going to acknowledge that this is some heavy, challenging territory that we're treading into. So I'm just naming that, I know that. And we choose to enter it very intentionally because here at Salt House, we try to do hard things, like the authentic, real, vulnerable things. And so today we're going to hear from Monica Lewinsky. She'll speak first about her own story and experience around 1998 and following that. Then she'll make some connections to how we experience the world now. And then she'll extend this invitation, which she doesn't say it this way, but she invites us to walk a path that very much resonates with the path of Jesus. So this was, the TED Talk itself was filmed about 1.5 years ago, because she'll make some references to recently and those kinds of things. So it was March 2015. It's about 20 minutes long, and already it's been viewed over 9 million times. So it's been out there. Anyone seen it before? Cool. We got 2. We're going to start about 2 minutes in. She's kind of done some joking around, and people have but then she dives in, and that's where we're starting. So this is Monica Lewinsky's TED Talk, The Price of Shame.
At the age of 22, I fell in love with my boss. And at the age of 24, I learned the devastating consequences. Can I see a show of hands of anyone here who didn't make a mistake or do something they regretted at 22? Yep, that's what I thought. So like me, at 22, a few of you may have also taken wrong turns and fallen in love with the wrong person, maybe even your boss. Unlike me, though, your boss probably wasn't the President of the United States of America. Of course, life is full of surprises. Not a day goes by that I'm not reminded of my mistake, and I regret that mistake deeply. In 1998, after having been swept up into an improbable romance, I was then swept up into the eye of a political, legal, and media maelstrom like we had never seen before. Remember, just a few years earlier, news was consumed from just 3 places: reading a newspaper or magazine, listening to the radio, or watching television. That was it. But that wasn't my fate. Instead, this scandal was brought to you by the digital revolution. That meant we could access all the information we wanted, when we wanted it, anytime, anywhere. And when the story broke in January 1998, it broke online. It was the first time the traditional news was usurped by the internet for a major news story. A click that reverberated around the world. What that meant for me personally was that overnight, I went from being a completely private figure to a publicly humiliated one worldwide. I was patient zero of losing a personal reputation on a global scale almost instantaneously. This rush to judgment enabled by technology led to mobs of virtual stone throwers. Granted, it was before social media, but people could still comment online, email stories, and of course, email cruel jokes. News sources plastered photos of me all over to sell newspapers, banner ads online, and to keep people tuned to the TV. Do you recall a particular image of me, say, wearing a beret? Now, I admit I made mistakes, especially wearing that beret. But the attention and judgment that I received, not the story, but that I personally received, was unprecedented. I was branded as a tramp, tart, slut, whore, bimbo, and of course, that woman. I was seen by many, but actually known by few. And I get it. It was easy to forget that that woman was dimensional, had a soul, and was once unbroken. When this happened to me 17 years ago, there was no name for it. Now we call it cyberbullying and online harassment. Today, I want to share some of my experience with you, talk about how that experience has helped shape my cultural observations, and how I hope my past experience can lead to a change that results in less suffering for others. In 1998, I lost my reputation and my dignity. I lost almost everything, and I almost lost my life. Let me paint a picture for you. It is September of 1998. I'm sitting in a windowless office room inside the office of the Independent Counsel, underneath humming fluorescent lights. I'm listening to the sound of my voice. my voice on surreptitiously taped phone calls that a supposed friend had made the year before. I'm here because I've been legally required to personally authenticate all 20 hours of taped conversation. For the past 8 months, the mysterious content of these tapes has hung like the sword of Damocles over my head. I mean, who can remember what they said a year ago? Scared and mortified, I listen. Listen as I prattle on about the flotsam and jetsam of the day. Listen as I confess my love for the president and, of course, my heartbreak. Listen to my sometimes catty, sometimes churlish, sometimes silly self being cruel, unforgiving, uncouth. Listen deeply, deeply ashamed to the worst version of myself, a self I don't even recognize. A few days later, the Star Report is released to Congress, and all of those tapes and transcripts, those stolen words, form a part of it. That people can read the transcripts is horrific enough. But a few weeks later, the audio tapes are aired on TV and significant portions made available online. The public humiliation was excruciating. Life was almost unbearable. This was not something that happened with regularity back then in 1998. And by this, I mean the stealing of people's private words, actions, conversations, or photos, and then making them public. Public without consent, public without context, and public without compassion. Fast forward 12 years to 2010, and now social media has been born. The landscape has sadly become much more populated with instances like mine, whether or not someone actually made a mistake, and now it's for both public and private people. The consequences for some have become dire, very dire. I was on the phone with my mom in September of 2010, and we were talking about the news of a young college freshman from Rutgers University named Tyler Clementi. Sweet, sensitive, creative Tyler was secretly webcammed by his roommate while being intimate with another man. When the online world learned of this incident, the ridicule and cyberbullying ignited. A few days later, Tyler jumped from the George Washington Bridge to his death. He was 18. My mom was beside herself about what happened to Tyler and his family, and she was gutted with pain in a way that I just couldn't quite understand. And then eventually I realized she was reliving 1998, reliving a time when she sat by my bed every night. Reliving a time when she made me shower with the bathroom door open. And reliving a time when both of my parents feared that I would be humiliated to death, literally. Today, too many parents haven't had the chance to step in and rescue their loved ones. Too many have learned of their child's suffering and humiliation after it was too late. Tyler's tragic, senseless death was a turning point for me. It served to recontextualize my experiences, and I then began to look at the world of humiliation and bullying around me and see something different. In 1998, we had no way of knowing where this brave new technology called the internet would take us. Since then, it has connected people in unimaginable ways, joining lost siblings, saving lives, launching revolutions. But the darkness, cyberbullying, and slut-shaming that I experienced had mushroomed. Every day online, people, especially young people who are not developmentally equipped to handle this, are so abused and humiliated that they can't imagine living to the next day. And some tragically don't. And there's nothing virtual about that. Childline, a UK nonprofit that's focused on helping young people on various issues, released a staggering statistic late last year. From 2012 to 2013, there was an 87% increase in calls and emails related to cyberbullying. A meta-analysis done out of the Netherlands showed that for the first time, cyberbullying was leading to suicidal ideations more significantly than offline bullying. And you know what shocked me, although it shouldn't have, was other research last year that determined humiliation was a more intensely felt emotion than either happiness or even anger. Cruelty to others is nothing new. But online, technologically enhanced shaming is amplified, uncontained, and permanently accessible. The echo of embarrassment used to extend only as far as your family, village, school, or community. But now it's the online community too. Millions of people, often anonymously, can stab you with their words, and that's a lot of pain. And there are no perimeters around how many people can publicly observe you and put you in a public stockade. There is a very personal price to public humiliation, and the growth of the internet has jacked up that price. For nearly 2 decades now, we have slowly been sowing the seeds of shame and public humiliation in our cultural soil, both on and offline. Gossip websites, paparazzi, reality programming, politics, news outlets, and sometimes hackers all traffic in shame. It's led to desensitization and a permissive environment online, which lends itself to trolling, invasion of privacy, and cyberbullying. This shift has created what Professor Nicholas Mills calls a culture of humiliation. Consider a few prominent examples just from the past 6 months alone. Snapchat, the service which is used mainly by younger generations and claims that its messages only have the lifespan of a few seconds. You can imagine the range of content that gets. A third-party app which Snapchatters use to preserve the lifespan of the messages was hacked, and 100,000 personal conversations, photos, and videos were leaked online to now have a lifespan of forever. Jennifer Lawrence and several other actors had their iCloud accounts hacked, and private, intimate, nude photos were plastered across the internet without their permission. One gossip website had over 5 million hits for this one story. And what about the Sony Pictures cyber hacking? The documents which received the most attention were private emails that had maximum public embarrassment value. But in this culture of humiliation, there is another kind of price tag attached to public shaming. The price does not measure the cost to the victim, which Tyler and too many others, notably women, minorities, and members of the LGBTQ community have paid, but the price measures the profit of those who prey on them. This invasion of others is a raw material, efficiently and ruthlessly mined, packaged, and sold at a profit. A marketplace has emerged where public humiliation is a commodity and shame is an industry. How is the money made? Clicks. The more shame, the more clicks. The more clicks, the more advertising dollars. We're in a dangerous cycle. The more we click on this kind of gossip, the more numb we get to the human lives behind it. And the more numb we get, the more we click. All the while, someone is making money off of the back of someone else's suffering. With every click, we make a choice. The more we saturate our culture with public shaming, the more accepted it is, the more we will see behavior like cyberbullying, trolling, some forms of hacking, and online harassment. Why? Because they all have humiliation at their cores. This behavior is a symptom of the culture we've created. Just think about it. Changing behavior begins with evolving beliefs. We've seen that to be true with racism, homophobia, and plenty of other biases today and in the past. As we've changed beliefs about same-sex marriage, more people have been offered equal freedoms. When we began valuing sustainability, more people began to recycle. So as far as our culture of humiliation goes, what we need is a cultural revolution. Public shaming as a blood sport has to stop. And it's time for an intervention on the internet and in our culture. The shift begins with something simple, but it's not easy. We need to return to a long-held value of compassion and empathy. Online, we've got a compassion deficit, an empathy crisis. Researcher Brené Brown said, and I quote, "Shame can't survive empathy." Shame cannot survive empathy. I've seen some very dark days in my life. It was the compassion and empathy from my family, friends, professionals, and sometimes even strangers that saved me. Even empathy from one person can make a difference. The theory of minority influence, proposed by social psychologist Serge Moscovici, says that even in small numbers, when there's consistency over time, change can happen. In the online world, we can foster minority influence by becoming upstanders. To become an upstander means, instead of bystander apathy, we can post a positive comment for someone or report a bullying situation. Trust me, compassionate comments help abate the negativity. We can also counteract the culture by supporting organizations that deal with these kinds of issues, like the Tyler Clementi Foundation in the US. In the UK, there's Anti-Bullying Pro, and in Australia, there's Project Rocket. We talk a lot about our right to freedom of expression, but we need to talk more about our responsibility to freedom of expression. We all want to be heard, but let's acknowledge the difference between speaking up with intention and speaking up for attention. The internet is the superhighway for the id. But online, showing empathy to others benefits us all and helps create a safer and better world. We need to communicate online with compassion, consume news with compassion, and click with compassion. Just imagine walking a mile in someone else's headline. I'd like to end on a personal note. In the past 9 months, the question I've been asked the most is why? Why now? Why was I sticking my head above the parapet? You can read between the lines in those questions, and the answer has nothing to do with politics. The top note answer was and is because it's time. Time to stop tiptoeing around my past, time to stop living a life of opprobrium, and time to take back my narrative. It's also not just about saving myself. Anyone who is suffering from shame and public humiliation needs to know one thing. You can survive it. I know it's hard. It may not be painless, quick, or easy, but you can insist on a different ending to your story. have compassion for yourself. We all deserve compassion, and to live both online and off in a more compassionate world. Thank you for listening.
Can we exhale? Just. In Matthew 14, it says, Jesus had compassion on them and healed the sick. In Matthew 15, it says, Jesus called his disciples to him and said, I have compassion on these people. In Matthew 20, it says, Jesus had compassion on them and touched their eyes. In Mark 6, it says, when Jesus landed and saw a large crowd, he had compassion on them. Jesus led with, was moved by, compassion drove his actions. That was his motivation. I love hearing Monica's words in this kind of final section that she gets into, this call to compassion. For yes, it absolutely echoes with this pattern in the life of Jesus. And I find it so provocative to consider what that means for us, to let compassion lead us as we engage online. For as Monica says, there absolutely is a compassion deficit. And yes, there is absolutely something we can do about it. So I wonder what jumped out for you as you watched. What stirred you, what things came to mind for you in this? To finish our time, I want to revisit kind of 3 things that Monica says somewhat quickly at the end, 3 practices of compassion. She kind of says we shouldn't be bystanders, we should be upstanders, like intentionally choose to not just sit back, but to kind of move things in this direction up. And she says, first, to communicate with compassion, with our comments, with our posts, to let those be fueled with compassion. Second, to consume news with compassion. I love how she says, imagine walking a mile in someone else's headline, right? Like this is a person who is going through this. An imperfect person, someone who's in the spotlight for whatever reason, but a person with a soul, with depth, who's dimensional. And then the last one, which I find particularly provocative for me, is click with compassion. The price of shame, as she says, is absolutely the price paid for things that we click on, that advertisers literally are banking on what we click on and what we read and engage with. So those clicks are feeding the future culture of the internet. That just really spoke to me in one of those ways that it feels like we're a bystander, we're not engaged, but that actually changes that which will be on the internet in the future. So I wonder, as you see this list, and with all that we've heard, we ask this question that we always ask, like, God, what are you saying to me, to us? For us in this modern technological landscape that we're living in, there is much that we can do to not throw stones into what's already happening, right? But we can choose to throw compassion into the arena, to throw compassion as we insist on a different way. We all deserve compassion, as she says, and to live online and offline in a more compassionate world. So I wonder, what can we do today, this week, to be moved with and to respond with compassion? So friends, let's take a moment just to sit with that question and to pray.